All right. So I thought that was a really wonderful opening for this exhibit to give us some perspective um, and to give us the context in which we're looking at this work. So I'm going to go back over here, and just for a few minutes, we can, just to ground ourselves before we jump into the actual artwork, I wanted to look through, just click through what we're not seeing in person right now, which is the way that this was organized and what she was discussing about the kind of bucolic and farm life photos, the flowers, the beautiful people that are working the land. You know, this is the way that it was organized. And you can tell from this that these are large pieces, and that even though these may not be murals, that just having these large pieces and these large, beautiful, bright colors really give me a feeling of what it might be like to be in this space. And we're going to look at these more deeply, these individual pieces, but we can kind of have a sense of how they are together and how they were curated together. Oh, cigarettes. Okay, so let us dive into the artwork. I want to just check our roster here. And I was thinking that, hang on a moment. So the artworks, there are 8 different sections. They each have about 5 to 6 different pieces of work, and they have a framing piece of content and then the actual pieces. So what I thought we could do is start with number 1 and then kind of fast forward to number 5. Because we have Roger here, Roger was most likely, I'm going to unmute you, Roger. Were you, oops, I can't unmute you. Maybe you have to unmute yourself.
I'm here.
Okay, great. So what I was thinking of doing was number 1 and then fast forwarding to number 5, because I know that you may not be able to be with us the whole time.
Right. Yeah. Middle of the workday out in Seattle, folks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. And then we can talk, because my work was years ago when they were putting this show together. They wanted to get some correlated work of artists that were influenced in the United States that actually worked with these guys. And so several of the family members of those artists were contacted, and we had to locate pieces that could really did specifically Harold Lehman, who invited Siqueiros to New York. And it was Harold that brought him to New York because he had known him in LA.
Okay, great.
So that's an interesting part. So go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, great. All right, so you'll mute and unmute. Okay, Roger?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is section number 1, and the video and the audio that we heard is what is described here. I'm not going to read this out loud. The others I will, because they tell us some specific things. But I want to pull up these pieces and just take a few moments to look at them. They are, they are on the screen and we can click through them. We will click through them, but I think they might be a little bit tiny, and I think I would like to show them in this format. So as this is a field trip, and this is an art museum, I'm not going to yammer on over all of these, but if you have something that you'd like to say, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. But I would like to have some just moments of being able to look at work, and we don't have to fill that space with my talking. And this is a photograph, I believe. Madotti, an Italian photographer who was mentioned in the video. I love this photo. Okay, I don't have this one queued up. So, all right, I'm just gonna check our roster, make sure no one's on hold. Okay, I'm gonna turn that off so I don't have to worry about participants. Okay, so you all saw the pieces, you got to see who they were by, and spend a little bit of time with them. So let's go to number 5. Okay, so we can hear a little bit about this. And this, of course, is near and dear to my heart, the connection to the New Deal. So I'm going to leave this up on the screen, but I am going to read it aloud. So this is Rivera and the New Deal. Diego Rivera came to the United States in 1930 as the most acclaimed artist to have worked on the Mexican government's public mural program. The hero of the Western world, one critic called him. After completing these murals in San Francisco, 3 murals in San Francisco, he was commissioned in 1932 to create what became a 27-panel mural cycle filling all 4 walls of the covered courtyard of the Detroit Institute of Art. In Mexico, Rivera had been known as a communist whose murals glorified the revolution and condemned capitalist corruption. His encounter in the United States with modern industry catalyzed his embrace of an altogether different subject matter, the abundance of the country's natural resources and its engineering and industrial achievements. The theme of productive labor had tremendous resonance for American artists across the geographic and political spectrum, working under the auspices of the various mural programs established by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As part of his New Deal, aka WPA, the Works Progress Administration, initiatives to promote economic recovery. For these artists who were seeking to assure the nation of its self-worth as it grappled with the devastating fallout caused by the Great Depression, Rivera's art was an inspiring model. They adopted Rivera's subject matter and his decorative, descriptive style, crowded imagery, multiple vanishing points, and montage aesthetic in the thousands of murals they created in the public buildings across the country. And it is pretty fitting that we're talking about this now in this moment in our time. So Roger, do you want to talk a little bit? I can kind of like pull up the images and we can just kind of look at them while you tell us about.
Let's set some background here. So one of the things that wasn't mentioned in the film is that what got the Mexican mural renaissance off the ground was that it was government sponsored. And the term that people used and threw around was that it was at plumbers' wages. And so the impetus to start the government New Deal programs started with that idea. A letter was sent from George Biddle to the President of the United States. They had known each other at Choate, boarding school in Connecticut, I'm not sure, New York, upstate New York, and saying, you know, we ought to do this. The government should support murals. And at any other time in American history, it would have been thrown away. It would not have been, nobody would have listened to that letter. But at this particular time, with Roosevelt in power trying to stimulate the economy, he seized on that idea. And I think Ennis is right to talk about heroic labor as a theme in New Deal murals. You know, it's not unusual to see guys chopping trees, right down to posters, you know, guys, you know, working in that. Although that was only one of the general themes of WPA murals. The others were historical landmarks, right? I mean, the landing at Alki Beach in Seattle, the crossing of the Delaware, things like that. And then later, an odd one, which is kind of juxtapositions of the past and the present, which is, it's not unusual to see murals that had like Egyptians and then juxtaposed against guys working in labs, which was to say we were great in the past, we'll be great in the future. You know, this depression's just this thing in the middle that's going to go away at some time. Here we're looking at William Gropper's fantastic mural. I mean, they're trying to draw a link here with absolutely Diego Rivera's mural, and I think that they've made a good job of making a juxtaposition here. Very fabulous. That's a mural study. The mural still exists in the Social Security Administration building, I think, in DC. Or no, he's in the post office, which was not the post office programs were not WPA art. They were sponsored by Treasury and they were commissioned. I've met a lot of artists in my life, like I was never on relief. I never was on relief. I won a competition for section murals. Marion Greenwood, again, I think the untold story here is this, which is Siqueiros was, I think, in terms of his influence on American art history, was the most important of the three. Because he was a teacher more than just an artist, and he taught artists in California how to create fresco murals. I mean, literally had classes on how to do that. And one of the untold stories of the New Deal period is the proliferation of fresco as a medium of expression in the United States. It had a kind of renaissance. And when Siqueiros went to New York, he worked with Marion Greenwood to talk about that fresco work. And so I think that it was technique and subject matter, not just this revolutionary spirit, because that was tampered down by the fact that the government was paying for murals and didn't really want to see, pitchforks and, so it was a subtle change in terms of activism, but a massive influx of technique and passion. And that is where the major influence was. And what's important is that it was taught to them by proximity, that the muralist had come to America and shown them how to do these things.
Uh-oh. We might have lost you, Roger, the audio.
Oh, I'm here. No, I'm still here. I'm here.
So I'm just clicking through and showing, to give us some kind of visual context here. And this is interesting too, just the organization and the vanishing points that were discussed. I think that's a really important aspect of this style that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a beautiful piece. Is this Marion Greenwood?
This is Vogel. Yeah, Seymour.
Oh, Seymour Vogel, yeah.
But it's interesting because this is very the American and the
Yes.
WPA like overlap here. It's like we've gone from revolutionaries to still talking about workers. We've got a worker here in overalls, but we're playing tennis.
Yeah.
and we're
basketball hoop.
Yeah, basketball. We're like holding up like sport as a high value. I find this interesting that this like character is shirtless.
Lost your screen here.
Yeah. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Now? Yeah. This shirtless character at the chalkboard, I find that very interesting. And that must be symbolic in some way. And I'm trying to figure that one out.
Well, I can tell you that it's an artist joke. So the government forbade, nudity. And so the artist tried very, very hard to get the human figure without clothes on it into their murals. And you see them pop up all over the place, and usually in a factory setting with somebody, with his muscles and all this.
Right.
So, I mean, it really is a little bit of a prank. They were told not to do it, so they decided to do it. So that is a form of activism. Right?
Great. I love it. And you can get away with that if it's a baby, but
right.
I love that. Thank you. That's a bit of information I did not know.
Well, when you get into because it was government programs, so all the documentation between the artists exists and it's live. You see letters from them like, well, could that bather, kind of have a bathing suit on? Could you do that? And they're like, well, it helps with the composition if she doesn't, and you can tense this kind of tension between them until finally their order is like, put a bathing suit on the woman in your mural,
Very interesting.
So it's really, it's very fun.
Very interesting. And who's this one? Oh, this is Ben Sean. So Ben Sean, you want to talk about Ben Sean?
Ben Sean is the true inheritor of one of the great artists of American history who never kind of crossed over into abstractism like Paul Cadmus. Those two, he continued to have that revolutionary further without his life. Later, he had a political poster that Ennis certainly knows with Dewey playing the piano and Truman lying across the top of the piano, which was to say, look, they're all playing the same music. You want my independent guy. So he never gave up his revolutionary further. And he was an artist that learned about revolution from the Mexicans and believed in it his whole life.
Yeah. He's so many people know of him in different contexts. So it's great to see his work here. Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you, Roger. I hope you can stick around, but I think did you have anything else that you wanted to share about your experience with helping to?
No, I just, if you get out to the West Coast, I did co-curate a show for the Tacoma Art Museum about the New Deal in the Pacific Northwest. And, it happened before the shutdown, and it was having overwhelming success. And I accept your thesis, Ennis, that people are looking at how we got out of hard times before and the solutions and the greatness. The cost of the WPA art projects was minimal in terms of context, but we still have these great artworks today. And I ask myself, when are we going to do this again? When are we going to support art and hold it up as an example of ourselves? Right? The art produced for the WPA was for the people, by the people. And when are we going to do that again? And now might be a time to fund it into.
Yeah.
70 years. So I think this is great today. And I think that this is a marvelous exhibition. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm so excited that you could be here with us. So thank you so much, Roger. All right, so let's go through these other pieces of art, and then we'll listen to some of the audio guides. Again, we do have the chat open. You can be talking to me. Thank you for telling me when my screen goes black or when you can't hear me. And I'm checking the participant list every so often. I don't see any hands raised, so I am minimizing that because it is hard for me to navigate with that participant list open all the time. So if you are raising your hand, you're not getting my attention. If you are able to chat, please do that. Okay, so let's go on to Orozco. Okay, so I'm going to read this as well. The work of Jose Clemente Orozco had a tremendous impact on American artists such as Jacob Lawrence, Jackson Pollock, and Charles White. Orozco was the first of the leading Mexican muralists to come to the United States, arriving in New York in December 1927. His first mural in the United States, painted in 1930 for the Freire Dining Hall at Pomona College in California, appears in the exhibit at as a half-scale reproduction. Rejecting the folkloric themes popular with his peers, Orozco focused on Prometheus, the mythical Greek titan who incited the wrath of the gods by bringing fire and thus knowledge to humanity. The never-ending cycle of conflict and struggle remained a central theme in Orozco's art as he continued to receive major commissions from institutions including Manhattan School for Social Research, Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and the Museum of Modern Art. Through such works as these, Orozco inspired artists across the country who channeled his visceral brushwork and uncompromising portrayal of struggle and trauma in their own depictions of upheaval and strife, both personal and collective. I'm just seeing a lot of themes of even just trauma and strife and personal, collective, it's always universally a thing that we relate to with each other, but right now more than ever, it feels really palpable to me. So this is that mural that Jackson Pollock went to visit. It's amazing. And this is Jackson Pollock's work. I'm going to try to find a bigger version of that. And this is Jacob Lawrence. So one of the things that I didn't mention during the New Deal section, but I think is true among all of these artists and very often attributed to the quote unquote WPA or the New Deal style, is that there was a lot of social realism in the depiction of human form. And a lot of people chalk that up to Russian influence. And I think that often, I think that's partly an American phenomenon where we associate anything communist with Russians. But, you know, there was definitely an influence there through the Mexican muralists also. But what I'm seeing as a curator of the poster information from the WPA is that they were much more heavily influenced by these Mexican muralists. So the theme and the thesis that this whole exhibit is putting forth, that it really affected our American art at the time, I really see it. I see it in the posters. And if we have a few minutes at the end, we can look at the posters and see it right away. But I think that's important to recognize, because this is a different way of defining this moment and this aesthetic. So this is Jacob Lawrence. Oops, sorry. African Americans seeking to find better housing. And the storytelling. And I see that we do have a few folks here, at least one, Netanel's here from Mural Arts Project. So I'm from Mural Arts in Philadelphia. So I'm excited that you're here. So it's Everett G. Jackson, called Embarkation. And this is Charles White. Hear this. And the colors I see, you know, during this era and this time coming out of Impressionism, and that those colors from the Mexican paintings that we saw at the beginning with the flowers and the people and their dress, and just, you can really see the influence. I love this one. This is Orozco. Wow. And lastly, in this Orozco collection is Landscape of Peaks. And this is 1943. So this is wartime, always controversial, always pushing the boundaries, but I can feel like a real heaviness here. Okay, so let's see how we're doing on time. Oh, great. So we have a few more sections, and then we'll listen to some audio guides and look at some more work. How's everybody doing? Good? Let me know in the chat if something's not working or if you have a question. Okay, so let's talk about Sigueros in Los Angeles. All right, David Alfaro Sigueros was the most politically and artistically radical of the leading Mexican muralists, believing that art must be revolutionary not only in its political content, but in its materials and techniques. Of the 3 murals he made in Los Angeles in 1932, Tropical America has proven the most lasting in its significance. Sigueros' encounter in Los Angeles with industrial technology and the Hollywood movie industry was formative in his artistic development, leading him to adopt the tools of industry, spray guns, blow torches, airbrushes, and photo projections, and to establish a collectivist approach to art making, both of which aligned with his communist ideology. So the means of production being in the hands of the people. The block of mural painters, as he called his collaborator assistants, included artists Luis Arenal, Philip Guston, Ruben Kadish, and Fletcher Martin. They were deeply influenced by Sigueros' aesthetic, especially his union of the sweeping rhythm of European Baroque art with the solid monumental forms of Olmec and Aztec sculpture. As Kadish later asserted, Sigueros coming to Los Angeles meant as much then as did the Surrealists coming to New York in the 40s. And really a very strong precursor to Surrealism. Just amazing and really, really pushing the boundaries, this work. So let's, oops, I'm sorry. I want to pull that piece up because that is a really, just take a couple seconds with this one. And this one, this influence on surrealist, American surrealist art is really, to me, very striking. Sorry. Here we go. It would be lovely to see these in person. And I did see on the Whitney's site that it says that the dates are to be announced. So it sounds like this is going to stay in place until they can open, which I was concerned it was going to travel somewhere. So that'll be, we'll get a bus and we'll go up there eventually. And I was just in Los Angeles. Jennifer Shipman is here, and she is the manager of the Mutmuz Gallery there. And we just had a Posters for the People show in Los Angeles in January. And I was on Olvera Street. So I was looking for evidence. I think this is being restored. I don't know much about it. If anybody on this call does, please share that in the chat. All right. So what I'd like to do now is come back to this one, come back to 4. I'd like to go over to 7. And there's a beautiful video. What I'm going to do is put the video on so we can just experience the actual in-place context of the murals in the Rodriguez Market. And I'll read the blurb from a different device while we're watching this video. It's about a 5-minute video. And there's no narration on this video, so that's why I'm going to read the blurb while we're experiencing it. Okay. The Abelardo L. Rodriguez Market in Mexico City was the most important Mexican urban renewal project of the 1930s. Named in honor of the revolutionary general who served as the country's president from 1932 to 1934, the market was designed to replace the city's congested street markets with a modern facility that would also serve as a cultural and educational space, housing not only a market, but also a daycare center, theater, pharmacy, dance hall, and library. Murals, portraying the production and distribution of food and the importance of hygiene and health, were to cover the market's interior. Diego Rivera was technical director of the mural project, tasked with advising the artists and approving their final sketches. But their actual work was overseen by the American-born artist Paul Stevenson, who had settled permanently in Mexico in 1924 and changed his name to Pablo O'Higgins. Of the 10 artists who created murals for the market, 4 were American. O'Higgins, the sisters Marion and Grace Greenwood, and Isamu Noguchi, all of the Mexican artists, Ramon Alba Guadarrama, Angel Braco, Raul Gamboa, Antonio Pujo, and Pedro Rendon, and Miguel Sabtrejo, were former Rivera assistants. Encouraged by O'Higgins to depict present-day realities of exploitation and misery as straightforwardly as possible, the American muralists avoided affirmative images of hygiene and food production in favor of those emphasizing the social and economic injustices suffered by agricultural and urban workers at the hand of capitalists. Noguchi expanded this directive, including a swastika among other images in his mural, to suggest the machinery of war, coercion, and bigotry. Hmm. Yeah, the context is everything. Amazing. Just being able to see those in those places. I think that's really important. I wish I could be there in person. And I love seeing, people in Star Wars t-shirts taking pictures and people pointing and all the different ages. It's something that's just timeless. And we're so lucky here in Philadelphia to have murals in our everyday lives. Yeah, it's really, really important. Okay, so I think we have a few more that we could do of these. And then listen to a couple of guides and look at some more work. Okay, where did we leave off? Let me see. Artworks. Okay, we did. Let's go here. Okay, epic histories. All right, here we go. Now, I can't help but think about kind of where we are now, what we've been working on for the hundreds and hundreds of years of our country since the beginning, and also the kind of connection to history. Epic histories. The economic meltdown that followed the 1929 crash of the US stock market shattered the country's faith in itself and its future. Guided by the Mexican muralists' creation of unifying national myths rooted in the struggles and triumphs of ordinary citizens, artists in the United States remodeled elements of natural history and everyday life into epics of strength and endurance in an effort to help the country revitalize itself. African American painters such as Aaron Douglas, Charles White, and Hale Woodruff, found inspiration in the muralist celebration of the Mexican people's fight for emancipation from the tyranny of autocratic rule. In constructing redemptive narratives of social justice out of their own history of oppression, resistance, and liberation, these artists transformed that history into a new collective identity, one that foregrounded the contributions of African Americans to national life. Thomas Hart Benton likewise celebrated the Mexican muralists, hailing them as a powerful countervailing force to elite modes of European abstraction. Benton urged his fellow artists to follow their example of using a modern visual vocabulary to speak directly to the public about socially relevant issues. Although from a contemporary perspective, Benton's critical history of the United States often relies problematically on ethnic and racial stereotypes of African and Native Americans, his goal was to invoke the nation's past in order to create a shared vision of the future. So let's look at these works. I think that's really important. And it was also something said during the video that there's a depiction that when we look at it through our eyes now, when we look at it through the lens of contemporary work, or if we looked at it through the eyes of people who are being depicted, it would seem very stereotypical. It would seem overly either patronizing or romanticized. And one of the things that came up in the intro video that I think is very important to remember is the aspirational part of this and the intention behind it. And that's the best we can do. That's the best artists can do sometimes. And also, just because something isn't realized or isn't quite the way it actually exists in the world, or maybe we don't know if it even can, that's art and that's the job, one of the jobs and one of the types of jobs that artists can have in the world and roles in the world is to convey that. this says cartoon for contribution of women to the progress of mankind mural, Lucy Flower High School, Chicago. And I just love her hand holding back this warrior, or soothing this warrior while holding back this warrior, and holding and like care, but also accountability. It's beautiful. It's just so beautiful. So this is Hale Woodruff, The Mutiny on the Amistad. Okay. All right. So it's 3:04. I think we have a couple more of these to go through. We did number 5. And art as political activism. Ooh, one of my favorite topics. Okay, art as political activism. The economic and social turmoil that was unleashed by the stock market crash in 1929 caused many Americans to question a capitalist system that no longer seemed compatible with the country's democratic ideals. Artists in larger numbers than ever before resolved to use their art to effect change. In seeking to mobilize collective energies against racial and class oppression and industrial capitalism, they turned for inspiration to the Mexican muralists, whose work was steeped in leftist social and political content. Taking their cue from these role models, artists in the United States embraced the belief that art had a social role. By revealing violent, racist, and intolerant histories that are part of the American experience, they hoped to provoke public outrage and would ultimately lead to a more just society. Among the most frequent subjects were police brutality against unionized labor, injustice against political radicals, and racialized violence and terror in the form of lynching. Okay. So this is Diego Rivera, man, controller of the universe. And this moment today, when we're talking about science and our lives and our society, it just feels like this could be something that could be created today. There's a lot of really interesting details in here. I really encourage you to, I know, crazy to think almost a decade ago now, I know. I really encourage you to, maybe go back and spend some time on the site, find the pieces you love the most. Yeah, I know what you meant. That's 100 years, a century. But find your pieces and spend time with them and think about what pieces they might connect to in American art, not just from that time period, but the whole point of this exhibit is to say that they remade the landscape of our American art. So thinking about connecting that in to what kind of American art you love, and if you see anything from these Mexican muralist movement people in there. This one we're going to listen to an audio transcript of. So I'm going to go ahead and go forward on that. Philip Evergood, American Tragedy. Wow. And this one is Anton Refrigier, Sandlot Riots, color sketch for a post office mural. I mean, many of these were not, many of these were post office murals, but many of these, the sketches, because they were so controversial, the artists did them. They were paid for these sketches. They were paid for their work, but not all of them were actually put on walls. So that's an interesting time too, where yeah, they were told to put a bathing suit on a nude, but they were also still paid to create their work, even if it didn't go public. And this one is Mitchell Saporin, cartoon for Abraham Lincoln and John Peter Altgeld mural, U.S. Post Office. And we're going to hear a little bit about fists in a minute when we listen to one of the audio guides. So fists and hands. Hands are an incredible part of these artists' representation of the human condition, and then how they are being used, how they are positioned as fists or open or together or clasping is a very big part of the symbolic representation. Okay, so one last one of these. Nope, I think we got one more. Experimental workshop, yeah. Okay, Sigueros and the experimental workshop. Sigueros returned to the United States in 1934 and again in 1936, both times to New York. During the latter stay, he established the experimental workshop near Union Square as a laboratory for modern aesthetic techniques, keeping with his conviction that artists could not make revolutionary art using the techniques and materials of the past, that they must live our marvelous dynamic age, as he put it. Under Sigueros' direction, workshop members experimented with unorthodox materials and new ways of creating art, among them pouring and dripping paint onto canvas, tacked to the floor. The workshop had a powerful effect on many artists, in particular Jackson Pollock, whose participation in the workshop introduced him to the possibilities of controlled accidents long before his adoption of the drip technique in 1947, which would make him one of the most renowned artists in post-war America. Excuse me. And we'll hear, I think we'll have time to hear an audio about this Jackson Pollock piece. So this is Sigueros, it's called The Resurrection. And you can see the surrealism, but the very like organic, very earthy, and bones and human. It has this human feel to it, to me. See, this is Sigueros. It's called The Electric Forest. Oh, I don't have a download of that one. So this is Jackson Pollock, Composition with Flames, 1936. Just amazing. Okay, so we're at about 3:13. I wanted to go over to some of the other audio guides. There are a lot of them here. We're not going to listen to all of them. We're going to listen to 4 that I've chosen that I think are give a good overview. But I encourage you to listen to them. They're very short. They're like a minute and a half long. And we'll look at the pieces that are being discussed.
We're seeing here a portrait of La Malinche. La
Hang on,
Malinche.
hang on. Let's turn that up. Let's get that up on the screen. Okay.
We're seeing here a portrait of La Malinche. La Malinche was an Aztec woman who was the interpreter to Hernan Cortés, the colonizer who conquered Mexico.
Assistant curator Marcela Guerrero is one of the organizers of this exhibition.
Because of her ability to translate Nahuatl and other languages into Spanish, people see her as a traitor. I find this view unfair. She was a woman who was obviously in an unequal relationship of power to Hernan Cortés, and she was just using what she could do to survive.
In the years that followed the revolution, many Mexican artists celebrated the fact that the nation was made up of many cultures, both European and indigenous. In this context, some people, like Alfredo Ramos Martinez, the artist behind this painting, began to celebrate La Malinche. And more broadly, artists began picturing the nation's indigenous roots, foregrounding the visual traditions of the Aztecs, Maya, Zapotecs, and others. Today, we might question the way some of these artists focus primarily on the clothing and customs of these cultures. For Guerrero, Ramos Martinez was different.
In a way, this painting gives a more nuanced understanding of who a real person was, who then became a mythical idea of what a Mexican woman is. It's stripped down to the bare essentials of her face, her eyes, her nose, her mouth, very frontal, facing the viewer, confronting the viewer. And in a way, with this simplicity, she's asking people, you have to see me as a real person.
Okay, La Malinche. Okay, I'd like to go to 507, a piece, Jacob Lawrence. Okay.
One of the most important historical events in the history of the African American people was the massive shift in population from the country to the city and from the south to the north between 1900 and 1930.
Henry Louis Gates Jr. is the Alphonse Fletcher University professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University.
Now, what's curious about it is that despite this massive social upheaval which it caused and which it reflected, almost no one wrote about it in the creative arts. Instead, it was an artist who told the story, and that artist was Jacob Lawrence. He was the first African-American painter to combine sophisticated experimental visual technique with the narrative tradition or storytelling. He's our first narrative painter. Storytelling is one of the fundamental components of the African-American tradition. And what Jacob Lawrence did was to translate that tradition of oral storytelling into another medium, a new medium, and that medium was painting.
Lawrence took a deep interest in the Mexican muralists, whose art was also often narrative. He especially admired Orozco for his bold approach to color and form.
Okay. Now I want to go down to 516, which is the Joe Jones piece.
The fist is a dominant image that you see over and over in the 30s that represent the solidity of worker power, worker strength, and in the Joe Jones, it's almost pushing forward into the viewer's space.
Barbara Haskell.
Roosevelt came into office, and one of the first things he did was he passed a bill that allowed for workers to unionize and to protest working conditions. And it unleashed a series of strikes all across the country during the 1930s because labor conditions were so terrible. In the Joe Jones picture, he depicts one of these labor protests. The man in the front of this picket line is carrying a sign that said, "We demand," with some numbers, HR 75, with some of the numbers blocked out by his hat. But it refers to a bill that had been proposed in Congress by a Minnesota congressman that would allow for unemployment insurance.
Jones knew Orozco. He also showed his paintings in exhibitions with works by Rivera and Siqueiros.
He was one of the people who looked to the Mexican muralists and really spoke about them as the artist that led his way, that showed him that working with social issues in a way that the public could understand was something that artists were obligated to do.
Obligated to do. I love that. I love this piece too, because it feels like some of the other pieces, this idea of a swell of people, like society being represented in this long line, not just a big bunch, but a movement. Okay, and then let's listen to the one about the Jackson Pollock landscape with steer. Let me pull that up. Get that one ready.
Jackson Pollock painted landscape with steer using an airbrush and automotive lacquer. He would have encountered these approaches while participating in the Experimental Workshop, an artistic collective that Siqueiros established in New York in 1936. Many of the workshop's activities were overtly political. They made floats for parades, including one that satirized the control of Wall Street over the political process. Another showed an army of workers knocking Hitler out with a spring-loaded boxing glove. Members of the workshop saw a philosophical link between such revolutionary projects and radical formal experimentation. Pollock participated in Siqueiros' workshop about 10 years before he began making the poured paintings that made him famous, but he continued echoing the Mexican artist's ideas long after they worked together, declaring in 1950 that each age finds its own technique. In the 1940s and 50s, American artists overwhelmingly moved towards techniques that supported abstraction, but the impact of the Mexican muralists endured.
Oh, amazing. I don't know, Sarah. Sarah's asking if airbrush was an innovation of this time. It feels like it was. We can talk if we have a few minutes. I do want to show you two WPA posters because I love them, but also because they are, you could just see it, direct influence from this. And silkscreen as an artistic medium was definitely advanced and the WPA poster artists are the ones that made silkscreen as an artistic medium. The way that it is done today, they're the ones that advanced that. So it may be that the airbrush at that time was relatively new. It feels like it probably was. I mean, there's been obviously blown paint for as long as there's been human beings that can breathe and put paint on a wall. But the airbrush technique felt like that was really influenced by the 20th century. Compare Jones' work with some of Sloane's paintings of the 20s. Okay, I'm going to look into that. Okay, well, it's 3:22, and we actually finished earlier than I thought. I thought I'd be running right up to the end. If people want to continue talking about any particular pieces, or if you'd like me to go and look through any of this, or you can listen to these on your own. I think you can explore this exhibit. I would love to show you two WPA posters that to me come to mind and also connect to me and other people on this call. So I'm just going to go to Posters for the People, which is our project. You can see it right there. I'm going to look that one up first. Robert Muchley. Work with care. This is my favorite WPA poster of all time. It was done by a Philadelphia artist in probably 1937 or 38. Yeah, 36, 37. And you can see the direct influence there. You can just see the human form. Again, this was many, many people, including myself, assumed that this is influenced by Russian social realist art. And now I'm looking at this through a completely different lens. I see the Mexican influence in ways that I hadn't before. And that's really amazing to me. Sorry, I'm going to leave that up for just a second. And then I wanted to pull up, because we do have Jane Weiss here. Passoff. I hope I have it spelled correctly. I might have it just with one S, two S's, one S. Oh no, embarrassing. But Jane is the daughter of Isidore Passoff, who created this poster and many others. This is a wood block. The work with care was a wood block also. But you can see the celebration and elevation of the worker here. And that is, that's indicative of Passoff's work, where the real folks were the people who were being depicted in his work. And this is one of my all-time favorites also. It's just a beautiful piece. So I don't know if you want to say anything, Jane. If you do, feel free to take yourself off mute. All right. So that is our field trip to the Whitney. We didn't even have to get on a bus or do anything to leave our houses, because I know that, you know, we just don't want to leave our houses right now. But I am so thankful that you joined me today to go through this subject matter. This speaks to my heart. This speaks to our country. This speaks to like just so much. And it's wonderful to be able to experience it together, even though we can't go there in person. So please let me know if you have any questions. If you enjoyed this and you think we should do more things like this, let me know. And I hope you all enjoy your weekend. Thank you very much. Great. All right. Bye, everybody.